Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks, your in-depth analysis and discussion of current events in the Western Balkans.
Welcome to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. Today we'll be looking into the results of the 2024 European elections and what they mean for the Western Balkans. Elections for the European Parliament took place between June 6th and June 9th, where voters in the 27 member states headed to the polls to elect 720 members of the parliament. They will play a crucial role in shaping the priorities and political decisions of the bloc for the next 5 years. While the European People's Party, the EPP, scored a clear victory, parties of the far right and Eurosceptic parties also made noticeable gains. Among the losers of this election were Green parties and Liberal parties. We did see clear regional differences across the continent, but also general center-right and right-wing dominance. While the incoming European Commission is not confirmed, the current president, Ursula von der Leyen, looks likely to get the nomination for a second term. This comes with support from the Socialists and the Liberals and does not include far-right parties. My name is Damir Kapidžić, and I'll be hosting today's episode. To discuss this, we are joined today by Dušan Reljić, independent consultant and former head of Brussels office for Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, and BiEPAG member Corina Stratulat, the associate director and head of the European Politics and Institutions program at the European Policy Center. Thanks for joining us.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
My first question goes to Corina. How bad is the shift towards the far right in the EU elections, and what does it mean for the Western Balkans?
Good afternoon, Damir, and thank you very much for this invitation. Pre-election forecasts already warned us that we could see as much as a quarter of the seats in the new European Assembly going to radical right-wing lawmakers. And in view of the results, we are basically there, as far-right parties have secured 24% or so of the share of seats in the 10th legislature. This is obviously a lot of seats, but there are two catches. First, from a time perspective, it's important to say that it only represents a 2% increase compared to 2019. In the outgoing European Parliament, the far right had about 22%. And it is also important to note that support for this kind of parties has actually been on the rise for quite some time. In 2014, for example, the boost that they got from the elections was of 12.5%. So in a sense, there was less space for them to grow yet again this year. And their success in these elections must be seen actually as part of a steady trend, as opposed to, some passing mood or exceptional surge. Also, on this point, I think it's worth highlighting that they didn't do well equally in all of the member states. For example, they underperformed in countries like Finland, like Poland, Italy, Belgium, Sweden, the Czech Republic, while very, very much excelling in places like France, Austria, the Netherlands, and of course also in Germany. So we've seen individual records being broken for some of these parties, but not exactly a collective tsunami or takeover of the European Parliament by far-right parties. In fact, this is the second and last remark I want to make about their success, and that is that in terms of numbers, as a result of the scores that they got, they do not have a blocking majority. This doesn't, of course, make them innocuous, but it does put their potential for direct knock-on influence, especially on policy making in the new mandate, into context. So I hope this answers the first part of your question. It's not as bad as we had been warned and as the alarms were announcing before the election. In terms of what it means for the Balkans, I think enlargement dossier remains an intergovernmental dossier. So the European Parliament is less in a position to call the shots in this regard. Yet, as a co-legislator on many policies, and also given that the Parliament has powers in approving the budget of the EU, it might delay or at least feel tempted to delay progress on things on occasions. Of course, enlargement also includes the Balkans, not just Ukraine and the trio. But again, even from this broader perspective on the dossier, I think the prospect of going into a more right-wing direction is rather dependent on how the center-right, especially EPP, behaves, and whether it will vote with ECR and ID rather than keeping its firm liberal ground. So it depends more on that than on the far-right parties themselves. In this sense, the influence of these parties on this and other dossiers, I mean, also when it comes to, for example, protection of minority rights or sanctioning illiberal governments, the influence will be indirect and dependent on the political position and the tactical direction that the center, particularly EPP group, decides to pursue. And I don't just mean in terms of opening themselves to deals with the radicals. That's part of how influence can be achieved. But also if parts of EPP or parts of the mainstream chooses to mimic or to match the far right's language and radical tones, say on issues like immigration, rule of law, security, we've seen it in the past. We could see it again in the future. This could further legitimize political incorrectness and also radical solutions to issues at a time when obviously we need quite the opposite.
Thank you for this. And I'm glad you mentioned France, because one thing that we did see was a strong right-wing shift in France. Now, Dušan, with the agenda of the current commission towards enlargement, the outgoing commission being more proactive, but we're still not certain if this will continue. Now, especially having in mind the upcoming elections in France, as well as the right-wing government in the Netherlands, can we expect a shift on enlargement policy towards the Western Balkans, specifically in the parliament, in the commission? Will this again end up being a weak portfolio?
In any case, the new commission and also the new parliament will focus on the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. The security issues in Southeast Europe are far less scary than what looms in the East. Also, and Corina said it already, it is the member states which are really decisive for the enlargement policy. The parliament at this stage is not so important. So at the end of the day, it depends very much on the political middle, on the conservatives, Corina mentioned the EPP, and the social democrats, whether they will enter unprincipled alliances with the hard right-wing groups. If they do this, then I think we will have a problem with liberal democracy in the whole of Europe.
So speaking of any potential champions for enlargement, meaning member states or individuals, do you see that there are any likely champions in the incoming commission? Who can we rely on?
In international politics, you don't have friends, you have interests. So it is in the interest of the countries in the vicinity of the candidate countries and potential candidate countries of Southeast Europe, like Austria, Slovenia, Hungary, so on, to support the enlargement process. But the decisive countries are Germany and France. And in the near future, it looks as they will be busier than ever with domestic issues and trying to keep the EU together.
So when speaking about keeping the EU together, one thing that we have seen, especially from President Macron in France, is this idea of a different kind of EU, where there's a core and there's certain sort of layers around it. Corina, all of this necessitates a change of EU treaties. Even enlargement to this scale, including all of the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova, would necessitate a change of the treaty. Can the EU use its accession pressure to try to seek this reform? And is there strength to do that in the next 5 years?
Enlargement is not the only pressure that requires the Union to reform itself. I mean, even the war in Ukraine and its multiple consequences, but also the poly transition, you have the green, the digital, the demographic, and so on, all these big crisis and their consequences matter just as much in fostering recognition that the Union needs to reform in order to respond to ongoing challenges or crises, but also to prepare for the future and for upcoming new problems on the horizon. But there are different factions. So you have, for example, the maximalists who would want radical reform immediately, an overhaul of the EU's operating system or major EU budgetary increases, including treaty change. Then you have what could be called as ambitious realists who are happy to fully exploit Lisbon, but also don't exclude the possibility of tweaking the treaties. You have then minimalists who don't want to substantially change the Union's primary law and would rather, do the least possible necessary. And then you now have also what could be called nationalists, or who basically want to review EU's powers, but not in order to foster European integration, but rather to bring control and policies and competencies back to the national level. So I'm saying this because this suggests that there is a variety of positions among different EU countries, and it will be very difficult to reconcile that. And this makes the prospect of treaty change, if treaty change is what you're asking about, very difficult.
To my mind, we are talking about introducing more qualified majority voting. And I don't see why smaller and politically weaker countries would agree to give up their veto power, because this is the only thing that they really have in their hands when they're confronted with the big guys, with France or with Germany, who believe to know better what's in the interest of the whole of the Union. To make it even more concrete, why would, for instance, Croatia give up its veto right during the membership negotiations with Montenegro? So, to my mind, introducing qualified majority voting in the EU is the best way to bust the Union.
Maybe one more point that I want to say on this idea about enlargement and reform. I do think that if we do discuss enlargement and reform, it's good to discuss them together. And I think it would be good to also think them together as two sides of the same coin, in the sense that potentially there is some room to argue that if the Union were to be seen in the candidate countries as trying or taking steps, making efforts to prepare itself for future enlargement, whatever that means. But I would say that if the two processes were to be thought together and to go in tandem, potentially they could add to the basket of incentives for the candidate countries to start moving on reforms and on doing their homework. It wouldn't necessarily be the catalyst or the silver bullet for bringing them into the EU, but certainly it could help alongside other efforts and incentives to motivate and advance the process, I would say.
I'd like to add something on this. We somehow assume that the relationship between the countries which are not in the EU and the EU member states is beneficial for those countries which want to enter the EU. This is the accepted wisdom. Well, my argument is that we are here at the moment in which the relationship between the EU member states and the candidates is doing an awful lot of harm to the candidate countries. And it has become a neo-colonial relationship. Because what's happening is that the countries attempting to enter the EU are exporting to the EU member states, the products of cheap labor and human capital, migrants. And they are not receiving any kind of serious compensation for this. If you're an EU member state, you receive solidarity through cohesion and solidarity funds. If you're not in the EU, you keep on losing money and you keep on losing human capital. And as long as we don't understand that this has to change, the socio-economic connection between the potential candidate countries and the existing member states, we are not really at the core of the things. We are staying at the constructivist dialogue, debate, which is really going into circles and saying the EU has to be more coherent, the candidate countries have to do their homework, and it's just completely missing out the reality on the ground.
To follow up on this, Dušan, can you tell us a little bit more about what both the new sort of European Parliament Commission and this maybe slightly pessimistic view on enlargement, what would it mean for the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, which again has not moved forward in many years?
Well, we are taping this conversation on the morning after the Trump-Biden debate on CNN. And I think that an awful lot of people have been opening up champagne bottles after this debate because Trump seems to be on the way to gain the second presidency. And this is, for quite a lot of people, not only for Putin, good news. Because during his first presidency, with his very short-lived intervention in the relationship between Belgrade and Pristina, he moved far more than the EU managed to do for a long, long period of time. So at this moment, I think the cards are being given out again in a different form. And I don't think that anyone in Belgrade and Pristina will, at this moment, decide to enter into any kind of commitments. Everyone will wait until the November 5th to see whether Trump is really president. And then things might start on a completely different trajectory. The guys negotiating now in Brussels from Belgrade and from Pristina, they don't intend to improve the livelihoods of their population. They want to achieve maximalist political gains and goals. So there is a stalemate and nothing will change as long as there is not an essential breakthrough.
And finally, Corina, speaking also about more geopolitical realities, what does the EU election mean for these? Can we expect maybe more influence of foreign actors with a weak pushback from the EU? And what is the role of the US, especially if there's an incoming Trump presidency?
Whether Trump comes to power or not, we'll see what consequences has. Dušan said, well, it could help in some respects, but of course it could also help in hopefully motivating the EU to get its act together and move at a different speed, in a different rhythm, with a different logic, with respect to the relationship that it has with its vicinity. I agree that the process is not ideal and that is not really delivering, but I still think that the EU cannot just be complacent about it. We do need to develop a relationship with our neighbors. We do need to save face also, given all the promises and investments that have been made over decades towards some of these countries. And so this topic really, really needs rethinking, and it needs proper action.
I think that it's good to end on this slightly positive note. I thank you both, Corina and Dušan, for being with us.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
So we have seen that we are living through this moment in flux, both in the EU and globally. The French elections are coming up soon, and we have US elections scheduled in November. There's a continuing war in the Ukraine. The EU and the upcoming Commission, they will face several challenges in their next term, and they will need to deliver on these, hopefully, while not forgetting their commitment towards the Western Balkans. Thank you for listening to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
You've been listening to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. This podcast is produced by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, a joint project of the European Fund for the Balkans and the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz. Find out more about our research, analysis, and advocacy at www.biepag.eu.